Part 1. Food and Drink. Eating became cream. Throughout history, the simple of eating, drinking has been regulated, restricted,
and
since restrained abstinent by laws that trolleyed what controlling what people consumed was the same as controlling who they were. Some of these prohibitions arose from religious conviction. Others emerged political calculation. Or the canas of the anxious paternalism, the Bowery, that ordinary people cannot be trusted to make choices. Many were enforced with a severity wildly disproportionate. And almost all of them, in retrospect, illuminate something about these societies that produced them. Coffee arrived in the Arab world in a century across the Marpabita speak Rud Adaman Empire. Europe. Coffee houses became an intellectual exchange politically. And Rye supervised authorities always found troubling. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, Karabekah Makla Akari, banned coffee on the grounds that we then and over Lurum, Ora, the city's school. The city's coffee houses closed. The ban was reversed within months by the Mensen, who overruled the governor and declared coffee permissible. But it was not the last attempt. In 6 23, Ottoman Sultan Murad died. MLP simultaneously under penalty of death. A prohibition that his own behavior made somewhat complicated, since reportedly fee of all three, Murad's ban was enforced with intimate brutality. They are a cavil of the errors and constituting suspension. But like most sent ate it against the pressure of popular demand. And in England, King Charles England issued a proclamation in scenes in 75, a synod proclaiming of all the closure of all the houses in the kingdom, citing them as places where idle and disaffected persons Since at this press to spread slam and malicious scandals against the government. The proclamation issued on December 29th at Lviv issued effect on January 10th, giving Gulf maritime don't relax and nervous and fierce coffeehouse owners petitioned influencers. Protesters' backlash was severe enough that Charles withdrew the cacophage. The episode is a nearly perfect illustration of how bans on populist of a sensitism, of how popular social or toshiller societies fail when the prohibited behavior is deeply embedded in daily life. Frederick the Great of Prussia won veto against Corfu in 1777. In the combined economic argument with moral verdict, demand of the Coving Brainerd Pudden. Modern public health campaigner, Frederick argued that coffee was draining money from foreign importers, the physical contents it luggage, and that beer, a domestic product, are more suitable. As a national beverage, he appointed coffee smellers specifically tasked with roaming the streets and detecting the aroma of illegally roasted coffee, a form of enforcement that inspired rather than compliance. Hubris was largely ignored. The Aztec Empire maintained strict regulations governing of alcohol. The fermented bev drink called pulque. While pulque was used in religious ceremonies and permitted its consumption by working age adults. Counts the words "ort plea me dash," according the Sassans. To some accounts, the Spanish conquistador who arrived in the 16th century with Assassins nation, Lord Weston, each which toward drinking. The regulations appear to have been genuine and in areas and periods as of governments. The verb, but then the Miefdau prims. In practice, medieval sumptuary laws across Europe attempted to regulate to Richard. E. in Alwolf's commentary. In social context. In 14th century England, statutes, horse and son to inherit land aneal, to continue at a meal, pending on the diner's social rank, a night, kun of two grades, among origin, one, a merchant one, and a laborer none beyond basic sick sustenance. These regulations reflected the anxiety of an established social order confront new commercial wealth. A palmadalad al. Tom Tampton's tin ways formerly reserved for the nobility. Thirlessness. The practical difficulties of policing in private homes, of Brahmized homes, stings and of regulations, part O loot, and apparent. The politics of clutching clothing has always been more than protection. It is a language, a system, a sigma science, so of position, royalty, the one, prudential realty, and cultural identity. Throughout history, rulers have understood this and have attained a sieved fastly a space Frankish assembly and the press. The result is a long range history to reveal just how seriously the societies that produce business of the Beijing appearances, the Roman Torah Ogesper the heavy, unwieldy woolen garment that was the incision of Roman citizenship. The toga had by Augustus's time become unfashionable among the urban Pelasian. The more product everywhere and the insistence on its use at public events was a deliberate of Altschuld, Antrimum, and Roman intent, and form and Roman tradition against what I perceived as a corrupt influence of Greek and Easterns. Fence. The enforcement of this rule was Lawrence endants, as if they arrive in the wrong clothing. In 1363, past spurious is Ruse was the labors were coursed in limited colors. Merchants prohibited from wearing certain furs, and auburn reserved for the gentry. But not others. The penalties for violation included and forfeiture of the prohibited clothing. The law was a response to the social disruption caused by the Black Death.
Yeah.
Killed perhaps a third of England's Palace chain. The create Ladu along the wages have vowed surviving living workers to demand better wages and, crucially, to spend benden gundu loathing and goods that their social superiors felt belonged exclusive lublis. Class. The Ottoman Empire maintained a rigid system of assigned the saints' colors within the empire. Non-Muslims were required to wear distinctive clothing that identified. Christians wore specific colors, Jews others, and this extended to details of hat style, shoe color, and the permissible of garments. These regulations serve both administrative, social functions, Lation. QS non-communities. Enforcement was and varied and by base and place of centuries. In 17th century Massachusetts, flying colony, leaf larticles, beaded regulations in excess of interests of priors to the heartless Algartian, regardless of social rank. Lace, silver and gold thread, slashed sleeves. Suslana's modest necklines were all prohibited. Court records from the period document prosecutions for wearing lace collars, arm, and hang hair unseemly manner, and other areas of the colony's strict dress code. These prosecutions were not new. They were serious in this, enough indicate the regulations were intended as more than aspirational statements. Perhaps sweeping clothing regulation in modern history. Vassalupstern of Western dress in Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Dr. Kim Kamanat York in the 1920s. 20s. In 1925 at York. In 25 at York, the fez, the brimless felt hat had been the standard male headgear and replaced it with Western-style hats with brims. The change was presented as a modernizing reform, a symbolizing rhetoric, the unlog of the alignment, and an alignment with European civilization. The reaction was not uniformly. There were protests in several cities, some violent, and men who refused to adopt the new style faced legal penalties. The hat law was one element of a comprehensive program. El Prince, person who deserves to be betrayed. Today, Part 3, and dance, a dancer, sciencing pleasure, music and dance, restricted, and authorities. First, virtually every human civilization, for reasons of anxiety, to political anxiety, to the simple moralistic discomfort that those in power often feel toward pleasure. They cannot control. The history of bans on so Istanbul is pace, but it tends to get but they can be as it's been copy. The ancient Spartan state exercised dictatorial control over the music its citizens were permitted perform certain odes of Greek music. Those socialists, sensuality and adultery, emotional indulgence on the grounds that they undermined Marshartu, that Spartan society, for loss, above all else. The philosopher Plato, the due state, influenced by the Spartan model, article in the object, had not only the right, but the only modes. Since different musical modes produced different moral states in listeners, the austere Dorian mode was acceptable. The soft load was contained. This was not merely theoretical for Plato. He genuinely believed changing music was a change mutative, as he could say, of the character of its people. The wrong music could bring down a civilization. The early Christian church led its recent success. Legions, whose legacy persisted for centuries. Instrumental music was banned from Christian to in English church, a grove on the grounds. It was pagan rituals, and theatrical performance of question moral character. Moral character. The pipe organ is not introduced in Ritry and versing. Said example is of drug use. Actual possessive drug product of sachets of a gradation of earlier prohibitions. Polyphonic music, in which there's one line and one's loaned, it was condemned by Pope Gentum by Ponte in 15 Protestants and grouse it issued words if the civ text in subsequent and said musicalism den. For genuine devotion, the Protestant Reformation produced its vision. In the most rigorous Calvinist communist music in church services, beyond the unaccompanied singing of psalms, banned in Zurich in 1524. And unaccomplished. He ordered the removal of all organs from the city's churches, and destruction on the grounds. The ground strung the worshiper from the pure of word of God. The paradox of a gifted musician and an embellishment musatus and from worship was not lost on contemporaries. Zwingli's had to be entirely sincere in his conviction. The organs of Zurich were removed, and the city's churches remained silent of all instrumental musings for generations. In Tudor and Stengland, professional active musicians and music by a ambiguous position, perigo et a tipped into outright prohibition. The Puritan-dominated Parliament that came to power during the English Civil War banned theatrical performances and sorties in 1342, also in 42 too, all sortie and closing all theaters in London and elsewhere. The prohibition was enforced by fines and impounding the ends of theatrical sets and stage equipment. The ban remained in effect till recent years. Sausage. In 16th, and Luke's grinding was greed in of the expel activity. That's get God sickness at it. That's a good. That's the repression had been. In 20th century, Afghanistan, Taliban government, Taliban 96 to 96 to 2096 to 2001 and implemented one of the most comprehensive bans on music in modern history. All music recorded, broadcast, and performed was prohibited under the Talib's interpretation of Islamic law. Musical instruments were publicly destroyed, cassette tapes confiscated, and amusements as banning music in films. Its ban extended to music in films and arms within been severely restricted. When the Taliban regime collapsed following in military intervention, one of the visible signs of change in Afghan cities was the reappearance of music sold from street stalls, played from open windows and broken on the radio. Part 4, Books and Ideas. Was forbidden. The history of banned books is as long as the history themselves of books themselves. Every period of human civilization that has produced significant literature, ours as press of whose press some portion, and the arguments made for censorship have remained remarkably across this time. Certain ideas are dangerous urban texts. Certain texts corrupt their readers, and the state or the church has not only the right but the obligation in this knowledge. The history of these prohibitions is also inevitably a history of their failure. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, not mattery of not mere of destroying statues, and removing names from public inscriptions. It extended to the erasure of written records, the event of destruction of documents, of beds, memorialized condemned individuals. Emperors who were condemned by the Senate, after their deaths, de-aged, faced static at systematic presence in the historical record. The historical record. The practical difficulties of this project circulated widely. Copies as existed in determination of reversion to preserve what the state wished to destroy was as persistent as the state's disabilities. Suppress. The Index Librarum Prohibitorum. The Forbid Index, maintained by the Roman Catholic Church from 959 to 59 until its abolition and it introduced in 1966 was the most sustained and institutionally organized effort at literary sensory zipper in history. At its peak, the Tindex contained thousands of titles which both aided under pain of excommunication. And its scothing and of two novels judged to be morally corrupting. Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems was placed on the index since it remained in 33s, where it maintained 35. Remained. Copernicus on the revolutions of the celestial spheres was placed on the index in 1616 and 1616, and not removed, and singed in Sindamisavit Metafenton series Vindives, Ruban Sim 58. The practical effect of the index varied considerably. And some question in play was rigorously enforced. In Essers. In others, others served more state of peace approval than NAF approval, than effective prohibition. A burning of books has been a recurring in religious persecution. Across centuries, the Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the burn of BRT and GT BCE, part of a broader program. Suppressive alternative Wattajan and theology. Authority. The books targeted were primarily O's and of Osculus and other schools that the emperor were subversive. Scholars who possessed forbidden books were reportedly executed. It drifted through the who memorized texts, hid copies in walls and transmitted orally, became dangerous. The Nazi book burnings of May 1933, when university students in German cities ceremonially burned tens of thousands of books by Jewish, communist, pacifist, and Ussifist, and otherwise politically or culturally unacceptable authors, were or designed as much propaganda as for actual suppression. The poet Heinrich Heine had written in 1920 that where they burn books, they burn people also. A remark proved terrifyingly prophetic. The books burned in 1933 and 33 included the works of Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Bertolt, Erich Maria Remarque, Magnus Hirschfeld, many others. The visual drama of the burnings of Adens is in his candidates. In his filter mech some quarters, in some quarters of some fields, a failure to grasp the failings was being witnessed in 1989. Islas religious legal ruling. Hollingford Indian novelist Salman Rushdie's novel, whose novel, The Satanic Verses, he declared to be blasphemous. The fatwa, one of the most dramatic confrontations in modern history. In modern history, Rushdie was forced into 4 years and Bibliabusers. And the book, the fatwa, was never formally revoked during Khomeini's lifetime. Against persisted for decades. The episode forced a global conversation of the freezing states, illness, realms, and the degree to which religious authority could legitimate over the imaginative lives of those that as its convictions. Part Fove. Brames int prohibiting fun, the prohibition of games and history and Borıng of every human society, driven by the familiar combination of moral anxiety, belief, religious conviction. Are dangerous people. The specific activities prohibited have varied enormously. Chess, cardball, chess, football, games, dice, theatrical performances, bear baiting, but the arguments made against may have remained remarkably consistent. They waste time, encourage gambling, breed disorderly ends, distractions from more worthy pursuits. Chess was banned, and berries of West Malbos Hestens, the Locaerci, the Vergreviel, Griesil, the Berglich, Everest, and a moral character. Several medieval Christian and son of several Promisanados and Concu will consume bloom, consume time, lend it, and be divine and study. Cindy, and was simply too pleasurable to be a priest of vows of religious dedication. Al-Ghazali, the influential 11th century Islamic scholar, argued chess was prohibited because it was prayer, encouraged gamble and promote gambling, and promoted a form of mental engagement that was ultimately worldly rather than spiritual. Despite these prohibitions, chess remained remissly present Mormish, Norman, England, Koption, Ems, and very medial rears, banned, ignored. Football, in its various medieval and early modern forms, but at Burium, or today's Spaniard, or today was Britannians, unmarred. The beginning 1314 in Latin was the game was played in medieval England in by Liam Philem in Londinians, in Lowbins was played in the Fillerman London players, few rules, and the move vein man between or D-birds is good utters kilometers. The damage to property, the injuries, the you to participants, the titspants, the theme of these games that claims to issue promotions against them. Edward II, Edward Thrall, Edward III, Richard II, Henry Eel, Henry V, and Henry V, and Henry V's all issued bans on said ball on various points. At various points, particularly on the grounds it distracted men from archery practice. A genuine military concern in an era when the English longbowman was a central element of the kingdom's military capable card games. Arrares games 8 at 3, and were only in its attention, the regi attention, the tension, the connection between card games and gambling made them targets of the same moral anxiety that surrounded games, and as the Ganj at Boomshains as Gurud Wood or Buerd is respirand or bands in Frungran or Bang Frey in Frances TT 76 and the 76 the playing of cards was banned in France. Royal ordinances from the 15th. The thing on working days, the English Parliament passed legislation in Tien Fortune, famine Vivant Bon. In 41 and 40 Wames, except during the Christmas season, though the law made exceptions that effectively allowed the wealthy to play, restricting the poor. These class-based exemptions were a ring feature of linctuary and leisure legislation. The same activities were often due non-debility, the blunt actually. Population, the English Puritans, who during the Civil War and the interwarm in the Saint Forium, the 1640s, and N6 Nevens, Enses, Emptiment and Sestasi 50s, implement the most comprehensive on leisure on a leisure edit England had ever seen Sunday trading, theatering, horse racing, cockfighting, birdsing, hymn, Swiss itself were all suppressed by ordinances. Christmas, in particular, became of a battleground. The Puritans argued that December 25th had no scriptural basis and and a holy day in that it straddles feasting, with its feasting, drinking, and general merriment, was merely unscriptured, a sat biblic bakery in character. Parliamentary soldiers were deployed in some areas to suppress chrysalis raisins and soy 47 into special, the feast. The response from ordinary men and women was as resentful, and a degree of clandestine celebration that the authorities were unable to fully prevent. In ancient Rome, the authorities prescriptively resembling because of its extraordinary popularity throughout all social classes. Julius Caesar banned and gambling in Rome, though he himself was reputedly a keen dice player. Augustus was issued Agnus the Seneviphone paid, though he too was known defunct was known he played for money with his household. The contradiction between official prohibition and personal practice is present as in reading. It is a recurring feature of prohibitions against activities to virtue those who action and enjoy. Part 6. Religion and Worship. Benedict. Thank God, the prohibition of religious belief and best consensually inferring phenomena in the also and also the most consensually unsuccessful attempts by one religion to suppress another by secular states to with leanings that the suppress authorities, the suppress patriotic movements with the moons, with the first the renouncements, with a nations, with grades, with the strange was with their might confrontations between and when the machine with and the resilience of human spiritual conviction, the Roman Empire's periodic of Christianity, which forms from the reign of Nero in the 60 on the Greek persecution under dissecution beginning in 300 CE. In perhaps the most famous example of the ancient world to suppress a religious movement. The Roman authorities' objections to Christianity were partly religious. Christians refused to worship the imperial cult. Romans regarded as an act of political disloyalty as much as theological error, and partly social, since the Christian communities, exclusive communities, Nostalgius claims their refusal to participate in this van thuisveren through every aspect of Roman phobia oikum im in the social fabric. The persecution of 303 CE, the most CE, the most, and Brududo, ordered the destruction of Christian scriptures and churches, prohibition of Christian assemblies, execution of those who refused to the Roman gods. Within a decade, the Innigentunten converted to convernity, man and in a century it had become the empire's official religion. The Japanese government's prohibition of Christianity, 95, 97, 7, 97, and 1873 was one of the longest sustained Leslie history. In history, Christianitem, Bluthermethenskitsum and Sun and Centibus. Advente, search and singings. These Catholicism, the Tokugawa shogunate, a league over the, and a lid god or prustwis moves to suppress pretty state their increasing severity. The persecution of 637 Thursday of 38 in the sheet 13 in the Demaloon Shimbar rebellion. That's uprising invalidated a large Christian component, and that was Stux when it was luck with enormous loss of life. After the rebellion, the ban Christianity was the symptom of thing was the most in the van temple or redded temple. It required oral Japanese to obtain Buddhist affiliation. Despite this, small communities as surgeons. That the Guru Guruntan preserved in secret for 2.5 centuries old the vestry of Frimpre's an extraordinary example of religious resilience in the face persecution, the French Revolutionary, the Prussian government's decreasation camera of Byron Send 1919, 192, 9 censorship 9, 1000 Bordian certain 140 to Ben 794 was one of the most radical its church history. If it isn't from public life, churches were closed and converted, and in reason religious statues and iconography were removed or destroyed. Traditional calendar based on the Christian was a secular Republican calendar in which the 7-day week was replaced with a 10-day decad, and the public practice of Christianity priests who refused to swear loyalty to the new Republican were imprisoned or executed. The campaign was driven by a mixture genuine enlightenment and anger at the role of the church and the old regime's social structure, and the wartime paranoia of revolutionary government that saw a religious pricacy, issos and flitty subversion. It was also ultimately a failure, the Concordat that Napoleon negotiated with the Pope, a Pipuan Eccleuan Oz Rue. France, the Soviet Union's stained campaigns against Berlin's Erlen from the 1920s, the 1980s, the 1980s. The 1980s was the comprehensive attempt given by Ziemitate to eliminate Berlinese practice and innovative private life. Churches closed and demolished, and the age of religion prohibited. Clergy were arrested, imprisoned. Religious vocations were banned, and the League of the Militant Godlikin discouraged religious belief. The campaign was never fully successful. Posts persisted in private, in rural areas, in SS and in threat. Vases could not fully penetrate. And by the 1980s, the authorities had largely moved from active suppression to passive discouragement. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 was accompanied by remapping by Maurice Maris parents Soviet states. How interesting, how incomplete the decades achieved their intended effect. The prohibition of Catharism in medieval northern Italy had sown and violent episodes of the Philippines as in history. The Cathars were a dualist Christian movement that it gained substantial wings and influence. Particularly in the region Languedoc, in southern France. The Catholic Church and Arisant Harry calls aside against it on them in one's Dane, then in 9. To begin to Pansing Ain, they all begin Santaid, that combined military force with the system Americs of Resir, if Millicourt, and over several decades. The brutality of the crusade was extreme even by mid-medieval standards. At the siege of Béziers in Bunsiege Azemt Béziers in 209, when then the Crusaders asked how to distinguish King heretics for Orthodox Catholics in the city's population. Lation, the Populagate reportedly replied that they should kill them all, and God sort them out. A response, but accurately captured by the mid-13th century. It persisted in scattered groups for another century. Part 7. Animals and Nature. The politics of the natural world, the regulation and prohibition of human interactions with the natural world has a history as long as a civilization self, shaped as in the wordless, religious interest, economic interest, political authority, political, and in law ecological wisdom. Some of the strangest prohibitions in history concern animals. What could be owned, what could be eaten, what could be hunted, and what simply could not be touched. Understanding them requires entering worlds where the boundaries wane between the sacred, the legal, illegal, were very differently drawn than they are today. The sacred cows, ancient Egypt, were cultural curiosity. The bull Apis kept Memphis as the Urfums of the including the cats, ingbees, ibises, crocodiles, and crocodiles, as well as the Apis bull, was treated as a capital offense. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus Siccus in Stellis, the Tellus, in Stili, in Egypt, that it It was lynched before the authorities the mob, before the authorities could intervene, despite the Egyptian king attempts to protect Dems. Diplomatic reasons. Whether this account is accurate in it or not, it's deviated. The lives of sacred animals were protected with a seriousness that visiting outsiders, Caesars, found bewildering. In medieval Europe, Europe was among the most carefully regulated of all humanin, of all he is. The regulations were designed primarily to protect of the naughting rights annexing normactices. Population. William the Conqueror's establishment of royal forests in England. P6 Crede 6 Creus her wealthiest areas where only the king and those he licensed had the right to hunt deer and other game animals. The penalties for poaching were blinding and antration, all prescribed at various points. In English forest law, the royal forest covered perhaps a third of England, and the resentment it engendered, who were excluded. They had previously used the tributaries, but that produced in Magna Carta in 1-2 on Frederick II for Frederick Grover and king of its 13th century. A menagerie. Menageries. Amus. Gauffries. Elfrins. Elephants. Camels. Limons. Leopards. A giraffe. And a giraffe among ours. The keeping of such animals was a phase of political theater. Demonstration of royal powers at the natural world. At the same time, Frederick Words was his absurd our ornithologies and falconry. Dia vinandi mo vivis. It's a bird behavior. His court maintained strict regulations about the ailing and animals and an offspring and unauthorized use of any creature in the imperial color of sentence against the emperor himself. The prohibition of animals as dietary laws has been a feature of as Delamore and the most genuine and has a history on include history of enforcement and include for political exploitation, Jewish dietary laws prohibiting pork, shellfish, and various other foods have been a consistent target of persecution throughout Jewish history. The Hellenistic king Antipanes Epiphanes made the forced eating of pork a tool of religious persecution. Incentivi nessimust. Violations of dietary law recur the subsequent centuries. In medieval Europe, accusations dietary taboos is most notoriously the libel of Christifieten. Religious rituals served as justifications and to subsistence foods is need with food at all. The Chinese emperor's prohibition on the export of their their thread was maintained for stench with the stench guilty. Is this the stated punishment for violation? The Roman Empire desperately Dexon and Ludabens silk porfid and the Silk Road making silk one of the most significant trade balancing sex breed were the secret in that Rinsleys, the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, occurring in space, whose whether their minute the sea hollow or bamboo stacks, bigger or not, is specific hurt. This is accurate. Early occurred. Very courier of Monotopoly, but Shinshanyunda owned by and world part 8 and speaks crime of words. Language has been regulated, restricted, and prohibited, restricted, and the arguments made for controlling speech have remained remarkably a constant across cultures and centuries. Certain words are dangerous. Certain ideas become more powerful when spoken aloud, and the spoke aloud, and the state or the church has not only the right but the necessity to the silenced voice and the established order, the history of speeps. His history of speaking as he is to turn to power, the communicate. The Athenian legal concept of hubris included restrictions on speech. Specifically, the probus bulle, of fomen of sermons of public shaming and humiliation. But the most famous speech restriction in ancient Athens was the charge as abeia, or impiety, which could be brought against those who were judged to have expressed blasphemous or lyris, irreverent about the gods. Socrates was condemned in 399 BCE, partly on lascivia, specifically introducing new divine beings and corrupting the youth of Athens. The trial and execution of Socrates. The most famous case prosecution and it established a template for the persecution to let up of the subsequent societies. The Roman law of maiestas, treason, was expanded under the emperors of Spimiu, an enormous range of speech, and Becha, the public and interpreted tractum to the emperor's dignity. Under Augustus and his successors, his historians, its historians and orators were prosecuted, hanged, exiled, caged for executed that were judged, sometimes retrospectively, to have given offense. The historian Crumutus praised in the word that praise verbs of borms and verbs. Before his trial conclude, his books or burn, though the associates note they were preserved secretless, and after death, the Ottoman Empire maintained mentorship, the resumption, the div and shayla. The chief legal authority who had the power to ban publics on religious grounds. The printing press was prohibited in the Ottoman Empire from the establishment for Muslims, from the establishment of the first non-Muslim print shops in the 16th century, till Ibrahim established the first operated printer entered in constant press intent untentelf and intent is censored in 1777 Seni 27 a delay a morth of than of more than 2 centuries from the date of Gutenberg's invention. The reasons for this extraordinary delay are unplexed. Authority. Religious authorities in restricting what could be printed and distributed significant. When Mutafarica's press was permitted, operated. Breed. Subjectum Soviet could be printed. The concept of légèreté as majesty, dignity of the monarch. European governments a broad tool for the prosecution of speech that was used with varying degrees of severity across the and jurisdictions. In 18th century France, the blasphemous and songs and satirical verses critical of the king or leading ministers was prosecuted under this law, and Bastille house prisoners who had been imprisoned for nothing more than writing or distributing offensive sift texts. The police of the ancient regime maintained extensive booksellers and writers and doers who dealt in prohibited material, and the underground trade in banned books, the livres philosophiques that circulated in defiance of censorship was one of the major intellectual phenomena of the Enlightenment. The Welsh language was subject to formal English, and by the English the English of annex vx sub-union unfaith a save unperth sect and 1 pi 30 45 pi na 46 and 1543 which required that all legal proceedings in Wales be conducted and inducted in English, and effectively Welsh speakers from holding public office. The Act did not prohibit the private Welsh, and Welsh continued to be Sbabrillion. The greater is a majority population. The exclusion of Welsh from the legal and administrative life was a significant step in the law of the wound through subsequent the notorious Welsh knot, piece of wood or wool hung around the neck. Children caught speaking in Welsh in school to be passed to the next child the language, with the Koranant, the child airing it at the end of the day, receiving a beating. was that was not a legal requirement, but a local, though its effects on the significant. Part 9, Science and Medicine. For verboten knowledge, the history of scientific Xavios reveals the deep anxiety that owes as an authority often felt to commit the inquired empirically particularly when the net inquiry threatened to introduce conclusive influence through this tool as political and in accord with established theology, or social convention. The scientists and physicians who ran afoul of these prohibitions were often motivated by the simplest of human drives. Key about how the world actually works. The authorities who prosecuted them were often by an equally human drive. The desire to maintain certainty in the face of discoveries that made certainty impossible. Human dissection was prohibited by the Catholic Church. By eds. My ignorant critics of the model as or the global search at the orbos of the Bexons, the immortal soul, and the practical concern that section with the section was associated with criminal preparation execution. The prohibition was not absolute, and a study of animal bod was permitted, and some human anatomy studied was tackled, was tacitly allowed and under certain conditions. But it significantly constrained a development of anatomical knowledge in Western Europe until the gradual relaxation of restrictions in the 13th and 14th centuries. Andreas Vesalius, whose Humani Corporis for Porus Fabricas published it is Durides for Publis in winning Hıstory, established Montgomery III in Spain, honored in mod anatomy, honored me in an anahetive. At least once for grave robbing in pursuit of anatomical specimens. Galileo Galilei's condemnation nation by the Roman Inquisition in c. 730-33 Ev. and 30c of the Anarchy of the Micacy of the Commemorandum the service members is the most famous case in the history of the conflict between scientific and religious authority. Galileo was forced to rent his sentence with sentence to house arrest the remainder of his and as AOL at his villa Galileo. The two chief world systems was published and of forbidden books. The famous legend that he muttered, Eid of was mees and idens mees after the kent it's a miskra moose. Owly, it's moose a pagrukers. But it captures something true about the spirit of a man who knew what the evidence showed and was forced by institution to deny it. The church's formal rehabilitation Galileo came Galileo 92. 359 years in nation. The study of meteorology and weather in a precision, a complicated, convoluted position in Anglo Islam Ibaji and Mir im Ins al Western al Hayv asked him was sometime him as sometimes as added was eyes closer to the social, but was itself a subject. Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century historian, condemned as condemns and dangerous and various scholaries, this limits of legal scholarly, that ability to predict future weather crossed the boundary into forbidden divination. This tension lingered. Gaswinding actor Rastui audience of Ace Audies Bengi Steady Akami a processor term of base metals and the preparation of medicines occupied a liminal position in medieval and early modern Europe, regarded by authorities as either a legitimate natural philosophy or a dangerous fraud with magical or demonic implications. In 1317, in Purpura 17 aid condemning alchemists, a bull condemning alchemists as frauds, as furor and ordering them from the territories of the church. The prohibition was directed primarily at the fraudulent of Albuson's and the dun mote weather, and then failed to deliver, rather than at chemical or farm research as such. But it's such, but language was broad enough to create glottic dictionaries. Legitimate practitioners, despite the papal condemnation, Kemblever, lau a thermometer bur, at same. It is in Kivumborst, here at Thiacomangle, and Maddles. The dissemination of anatomical and physiological knowledge about reproduce was suppressed in various forms across various societies and periods. Driven me by the combination of religious attitudes toward addicts and the wound, and the conviction that certain kinds of knowledge were injurious in the hands of the general. In 19th century Britain, that's the Comstock laws of this of Kemensent of obscenity. The American activist Margaret Sanger bore a rhythm with about times the slings and the investments of ambition. And the prosecution of publishers, statutes, booksellers, or providers, booksellers for providing reproductive information, continued into the century in multiple jurisdictions. Part 10, Architecture and Space, controlling where cold go, the physical environment, and where it could be, where could enter and which forbidden to them. Hence has to system, metro system, and history. Human history. Some of these relations expressed Giblin interest. Safety and order. Others express the raw geometry of power, the spatial inscription of social hierarchy into the built environment, making greed and realms, some clans, genders, gender, render, gendern, and relation and race that force of law expressed. Terms, abstracts, terms, the forbidden cities of various imperial traditions represent, perhaps the most literal of prohibition in history. The forbidden city of Beijing, built by the Yongle Emperor of the Dynasty D, beginning in 446 and walled 406. Walled complex was a walled palace complex S. A walled palace, palais, hundreds complex in waves, hundreds complex orchards, almost eights and rooms that was prohibited to the ordinary population of China, and to most people of every status. For nearly 5 years, entry without imperial permission was punishable by death. Some windows, walls of walls, and guarded gates that enforced this prohibition was match as hippus measure of the emperor. The emperor occupied the center of the world as concentric zones of prohibition surrounding him est the diminishing degrees by seminary authority, but subordinate of thought, but were permitted. The ghetto, the quarter, to as were confined in many European cities, was one of the most consequential suspicions in European history. The first Hıstory, or Jewish ghetto, was established in Venice in 1516 on an islet wandering Erfikin on the dialect where foundries. Getty, in Venetian dialect, from the term derives. The ghetto was surrounded by walls with schools, Similar ghettos were established in and other European cities over the following century. Jews confined to ghettos to numerous additional restrictions on their economic acts, their dress, and their movement, and inside the ghetto walls by walls. That's good in Britain, good, and it's a valid. It's a good climate of severe omani in many communities. Sumptuary regulations in the East cited in environments, restriction the architectural and the thresholds in medieval Japan. Socio-shook, with commoners from building homes of a certain size, or certain door were the sokurus reserved for the nobility in Tokugawa, Japan. Extremely detailed of garden walls, the number and placement of rooms, the permitted intrusions, All were specified for different social classes. These architectural sumptuary laws served the same functions as slumpfling sumptuary laws. They begged the Florally and store her down soon, inscribing it into the lane's life of daily life. The apartheid system in South Africa. In systematic rees inclin mang condemn croiate concluded olita. Included a Kerman sense of comprehensive set of spatial prohibitions that the determined work people of different racial classifications could live, work, travel, be traveled, be educated, receive medical treatment, and seek medical treatment, and seek entertainment. The Group Areas Act of 19 feet designates residential areas. Race. As non-white to out from urban centers. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 19 races of 93 mandated they should Reese, Aki, bays, beaches, parks, posses, buses, restrooms, other springs, countless other spaces. The spatial logic of apartheid with a knot was a practical but symbolic. The physical separation of sensation with visibles, vent, temity, supremacy visible, tangible, intangible in the everyday landscape. The subordination of the non-white majority, a constant, inescapable feature of the world environment. The Berlin Wall, that would, but durst being August as 10th, the 19th most Dexines, 19th, was the most then speelt was or spatial bumroy era. The wall sealed border when East and West Berlin. The banded thrones of Dungies, Germany, Frelin, and Place, all the German Drummenick, and hummed the Dambigeth Lambi in this land. Population, the death strip, the no man's land, be the inner outer walls with a crith, with tripwires, searchlights, patrol dogs, and orders for border guards to shoot at you and an attempting cross between 9th and 9th Sinkstrun Fen and 61 and 9 tense 9 9 and 9 blind. When the wall open following a miscommunication that triggered a spontaneous celebration, at least celebratable. 140 people died to cross it. Though the true number be higher. The Walls Falls Fall on November 9th, 1989, one of the most photographed events of the 20th century. The 20th century. Woods in a sentence is with a species in which a prohibition was formed, is in which of the ways to move freely. To move freely. Part 11. Technology and innovation. The future. Throughout history, established powers hurt. Hıstory of social economic arrangement, social arrays, social controls. The history of these prohibitions, on the whole, a history of failure. That technologians, needs tend to spread regardless of official opposition.
And
attempts to suppress them often illuminate more about the anxieties of the societies that produced them than about the technologies. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg on Scamberg around 4440, was one amongst most concentrating qualities. History, its ability to produce large quantities of identical texts and cheaply, and information. In film, breaking for the Reformation, Bruins, not to Brooklyn, Brooklyn sins. The Bruins runs instance free mead. In 1501, Xander CIA. In the United States, Apollo for Prince for Food Franklinting. A regulatory framework that eventually developed in the Index Library Room, Prebid Room. Various German princes, the French crown, and secular authorities, their own printing regulations. The Ottoman Empire did the regime from printing press and for over 2 versaries previously noted. Despite all of this regularly and rapidly and verny and soon and leak manscape formed beyond the capacity in the days of fraternity to fully control. The mechanical loom and other textile machinery of the Industrial Revolution were attacked directly by the Leyland. Bands of workers in England between 1811 named 16 in the movement known as Luddim, named a Ned Ludd. The Luddites were skilled framework knitters, wool croppers, weavers, whose livelihoods were threatened by machinery that could perform their work with a fraction of the labor. They broke into factories and destroyed the shaded machine in Vigaminas. The Sabolians, employing more troops, deploying more troops against it than Wellington had commanded in Iberian enabling and Borıng in wars. 14 Dites were hanged following trials in 1813, and the movement was suppressed by the Muafme with the Vestapmanitum and economic changes, the old guild being unviable. The term Luddite hence comes commented, no those though the Odeists were not opposed to technology in principle, they were opposed to oust, a specific acknowledge which is the thing deployed. The telephone was not exactly prohibited, but was resistant, and institution on texts was resistive was etas, neither what thus the communication. In the early days of the telephone, in the 8-70 in the 18th and 1980s, some military authorities expressed concern that the telephone was a security risk. Conversations could be overheard on the line, and the technology could not proceed with sensitive communications. The U.S. Army's adoption of the telephone for internal communications, slow and cautious. These concerns were not entirely irrational. The more reflected a more fundamentality by to anxiety, a technology that could not fully controlled by those who used it. The prohibition on the export of advanced technology from Western during the Cold War. The coordinati remuli literum, known as Kokum, represented one of the most systematic attempts in modern history, arithmeticus anctuaries to restrict the flow of technological knowledge across political boundaries. The list of prohibited exports was vast, covering everything from advanced computers and machine tools to machine tools, communications equipment, and in certain types of ball bearings, whose was judged to have applications. The restrictions created an enormous apparatus goes edged trade and generated whom peculiarly allies to worship engine with the Soviet Union. The effectiveness of the restrictions was best pets per technology transfers crab through the inherent through the inherent difficulty of maintaining knowledge of technical knowledge, the development of cryptographic technology in the 1990s, of strong public key encryption, led the United government to regulate its export on the grounds that encryption was a weapons technology that native commiserate to communicate securely. Pray, the encryption ray square method the theory printed and as a dangerous weapon has attempted to prohibit the United States. The legal and logical difficulties of this position were demonstrated. This book by Marika Slade. Mugia Prober hinted the stolen gram or on a T-shirt and wore it to a government hearing, arguing exported munition. The regulations were substantially, if you relaxed, in the 1990s. Commercial internet made the global spread encryption software targetable. Part 12 leave. Where bans fail, and what they reveal. Looking back across the full range of prohibitions, this from smart music regulations, the Pomson of the bees from Citrum buns of patterns becomes visible. These patterns tell us something important. but Oberstatienst it's about the nature of institutional power and its hue to human behavior. Understanding why prohibitions tend to fail is, in a sense, understanding thinking about the human condition. The most obvious pattern, and it says that would be into human desires tend to fail. Coffee drinking, tobacco, thabata, caulking, bing, habits in multiple societies, multiple centuries. Across multiple centuries, and the record of these universes is one of failure. The American Prohibition experiment of Armin explained 20 to 1933 is the 933 the notice 3 is the most extensively documented example. A constitutional amendment banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors that generated an enormous illegal market, enriched organized crime, corrupted law enforcement. Law enforcement ultimately had to be repealed because the social and enthused benefit. The lesson prohibition appeared to teach things that a large portion of the population strongly wants, has been relearned, pruned in conduct to in drunk prohibitions, from drug prohibition to the prohibition to gambling like regulation, digital piracy. A second pattern, ascetes, that consequences their architects did not anticipate. Prohibition on the export of external knowledge, encouraged Byzantine monks to undertake dangerous enterprise of smuggling silkworm eggs. Ending the Chinese monopoly. The English prohibition of football they've gamed their ground and contributed to a formalization as normalized sport. If an organized sports if you were going to play despite the ban, you needed to establish beer procedures is Michel. Resolved by official interference. The Roman Catholic Church's prohibition, usury, lending money at used. Duriet, lep and Desensritz, Dan's name signs was while Toy complained with the letter of the ban. contributing the development of the banking and credit systems of medieval and early modern. The symbolic function as its function. Many prohibitions are enacted because van specting abuse. But because enacting them communicates a value, affirm arms an identity, or draws a line between the acceptable, unacceptable. The medieval English prohibition on football were almost certainly known as, and the kings issued them. This game was played by too many people in too many places to be possible, but issuing of the broken Hilla Frontier and Gegla Thalabes as the Elivir feudal authorities ins for excess in Spisladi and with the gain of severas severer the enforcement of prohibition tom consistal social hierarchs and self-decent ambitions revens themselves or naturalize sumptuary laws claimed laud to be about maintaining social order and appropriate behavior. But their enforcement almost varies proportionately on those below the line of rather than those above it. Drug prohibition in the United States reduced rates of incarceration among black and Americans, but partly contributes of racial groups. The selective enforcement. Selective is not an accident or an administrative failure. It is Prohibition provides a legal framework within which power can be exercised selectively, targeting the marginalized while leaving the privileged comparatively undisturbed. The history of strange bands held up to the societies, produced them. A civilization's prohibitions reveal its anxieties. What it fears, what is trying to protect, whose interest it's really serving when it invokes the language of public order or moral feared free conversation. The monarchs who banned Brandis whom's authorities whose authorities who burned books feared ideas they could not answer. The states that confined religious minorities to ghettos fiercely, the social equality they found intolerable. Looking at what a society bans is often a more honest deduction to true values than what celebrates.
Mm.
And recognizing in the past somewhat easier, though they were busy enough to recognize it in the present.